Welcome to Black Cube Productions 2022. I'm your host, Roger Cluton, and if you are new here, I want you to know this show is not for the faint of heart. We go into places most people are too afraid to look. We ask the questions most are too conditioned to ask. And tonight, we go all the way back, further back than most history books dare to go. But before we do, I need you to do something for me right now. Smash that like button. Smash it hard. Share this episode with someone in your life who you know is ready to hear this. And subscribe, because what we're building here at Black Cube Productions is something you do not want to miss a single episode of. The truth has been buried long enough. Let's dig.
There is a civilization that has been scrubbed from the official record, mocked, dismissed, called myth, called legend, called the delusions of ancient storytellers who didn't know any better. I am talking about Atlantis. But what I'm going to tell you tonight is not the version you've been handed by Hollywood or academia. This is something deeper. This is a story about a world that was not isolated, not primitive, not backward. This was a civilization so advanced, so spiritually and technologically evolved that what they built makes our modern achievements look like children stacking blocks. And here is what they don't tell you in school. Atlantis was not alone. While Atlantis rose in the west, the great civilization of Egypt was flowering in the east. The Sumerians built their cities between the rivers. The Mayans stretched across the jungles of the south. 4 great civilizations, 4 great nations, and they were all connected. Not by roads, not by trade ships, though those existed. They were connected by something far more extraordinary. They called it the Earth Grid. Imagine a vast, invisible network woven across the entire surface of this planet, a living web of electromagnetic energy, harnessed, shaped, and amplified through a series of nodes installed at precise geometric points across the Earth's surface, sacred sites, power points, places where the natural resonance of the planet was strongest. Through this grid, energy flowed freely between the 4 nations. Healing energy, agricultural energy, the kind of power that kept crops growing in perfect seasons, that maintained the health of entire populations, that lit not just buildings but minds, the kind of illumination that connects a human being to something greater than themselves. And through this same grid, they communicated. Not with wires, not with satellites, but with consciousness itself, amplified and transmitted through the nodes of the grid. A thought sent from Atlantis could be received in Egypt within moments. A vision shared by the Mayan priests could be witnessed in the halls of Sumer. They were, in the truest sense of the word, one people, separated by oceans and continents, but unified by something invisible and sacred. This was not fantasy. This was engineering, the greatest engineering project the world has ever known. But how was such a network built? This is where the story becomes even more extraordinary. In the beginning, in the deep dawn of this civilization, they did not work alone. They worked alongside beings known across every ancient culture by many names. The Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Shining Ones. Call them what you will, but in the oldest texts of Sumer, in the temple carvings of Egypt, in the oral traditions of every indigenous people on this earth, there are records of a collaboration, a partnership between humanity and those who came before. The Anunnaki brought knowledge. They brought the mathematics of the grid, the geometry of the nodes, the understanding of how to tap into the Earth's own electromagnetic heartbeat and shape it into something usable. And humanity, the 4 great nations, provided the hands, the hearts, the generations of dedicated labor and devotion that turned those plans into reality. Node by node, stone by stone, across mountains, across deserts, across ocean floors, the grid was built. It took many years. It spanned 3 full generations of builders, fathers teaching sons, mothers teaching daughters, entire families whose purpose, whose identity, whose sacred calling was to complete this great work. And they did. When the last node was activated, when the grid hummed to life across the entire planet for the first time, what followed was the most extraordinary event in the history of this world. They called it the Great Convergence. The 4 great nations, Atlantis, Egypt, Sumer, and the Maya, came together. Not just in spirit, not just through the grid, but physically. Delegations traveled across oceans. Sacred fires were lit at the same moment on every continent. The grid carried their songs to one another across the distance. And for a time, a golden, luminous time that every ancient tradition remembers in some form, the earth itself seemed to sing. It was not just a celebration, it was a consecration, a recognition that these 4 families, these 4 branches of the great human tree, were bound together in a covenant as old as creation itself. They shared food, they shared ceremony, they shared knowledge. Children of one nation were given names in the language of another. Marriages were made across continents. The 4 nations became, in the truest sense, one. This was the pinnacle. This was the height. This was the world as it was meant to be. And then they came. No one remembers exactly where they came from. The oldest accounts describe them only in terms that feel more like a warning than a description. Pale, cold-eyed, arriving on ships unlike anything the 4 nations had seen. Dark vessels that moved without wind, that carried not gifts but weapons hidden beneath the decks. At first, as was the way of all 4 nations, they were welcomed, because that was who these people were. Hospitality was not a virtue to them. It was a foundation, a law as fundamental as gravity. You do not turn a stranger away. You do not greet an unknown face with suspicion. You feed them. You house them. You show them the beauty of what you have built. And so the pale conquerors were welcomed into Atlantis. They were welcomed in Egypt, in Sumer, among the Maya. Every nation opened its arms, because every nation believed at its core that all beings deserved that grace. The pale conquerors smiled. They accepted the food. They accepted the shelter. They marveled, oh, they marveled at the grid, at the nodes, at the sacred knowledge that the 4 nations shared openly and without suspicion. And they began to take notes.
It did not happen overnight. That is perhaps the most insidious thing about what they did. If they had arrived with swords drawn and armies marching, the 4 nations would have seen it, would have understood it, would have responded, even without the art of war, with the full force of a unified civilization. But they did not come that way. They came with smiles, with flattery, with the slow, patient poison of manipulation. They positioned themselves in places of trust, advisors, traders, intermediaries. They learned the languages, they adopted the customs, outwardly, and one by one, quietly, surgically, with a patience that bordered on the inhuman, they began to corrupt what was sacred. Sacred ceremonies were reinterpreted. Ancient knowledge was subtly twisted. The keepers of the grid found their roles being questioned, undermined, replaced by those who answered to different masters. The 4 nations had never had enemies. In the entire history of their civilization, conflict had been unknown to them. They had no framework for recognizing what was being done to them. They had no word for betrayal in its deepest form, because betrayal had never existed in their world. And that innocence, that beautiful, sacred innocence, was used against them like a blade.
The grid began to fail, not all at once, node by node, sector by sector.
The pale conquerors had learned enough of the grid's geometry to know where to strike. Key nodes were sabotaged, not destroyed, but corrupted. Their resonance was inverted. The energy that had flowed freely between the nations began to stutter, to fragment, to turn inward. Where once the grid had carried healing, it now carried static. Where once it had unified consciousness across continents, it now sowed confusion. People who had always felt connected to their brothers and sisters across the ocean began to feel alone, cut off, like a limb that has lost its circulation. The Anunnaki, who had guided the great work, withdrew. Their departure was not sudden but gradual, as if they too were watching from the edges, grieving what was unfolding, bound by laws they could not override. The 4 nations felt it. The elders felt it first, that deep wrongness in the energy of the world, like a song played in the wrong key. They gathered in secret. They spoke in hushed voices of what was coming. And in their hearts, though they did not yet speak the words aloud, they knew. The great age was ending.
The elders of all 4 nations were not fools. They had built a civilization that spanned the globe. They had mapped the stars, understood the cycles of the ages, and maintained harmony for generations beyond counting. And when, at last, they allowed themselves to see the full picture, the full scope of what had been done to them, what they felt was not panic, it was grief. A grief so immense that the oldest accounts say the sea itself wept with them. They had loved without condition and been betrayed without warning. They had given everything and had it turned into a weapon against them. And then, once the grief had passed, they made a decision. They could not fight, not because they were weak, but because war was a poison they refused to put into their own veins. To take up the weapons of the pale conquerors would be to become them, and that above all, was the one thing they would not do. So instead, they chose preservation. If they could not save the civilization, they would save the knowledge. If they could not hold the world, they would bury the truth deep enough to survive whatever darkness was coming, and wait for the age to turn, wait for the children of the future to be ready to receive it. The work of hiding began in secret, in the final years before the collapse. In Egypt, the knowledge was encoded into the architecture of the great monuments, built not as tombs but as libraries. Stone books written in the language of mathematics and geometry, designed to endure not for centuries, but for ages. Everything that mattered, the grid schematics, the astronomical alignments, the sacred frequencies, was carved into stone that no conqueror could burn. The Maya encoded the cosmic calendar into their temples, a clock set not to years, but to great cycles of ages, a message to future generations that would say, this is when the cycle completes, this is when it begins again, remember. The Sumerians pressed their knowledge into clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, hidden beneath the desert in vaults that have not yet all been found. And in Atlantis, knowing what was coming for their island, the greatest teachers loaded what could be carried onto ships and sailed in every direction. East to Egypt, south to the Americas, north into the forests of Europe. Seeds of knowledge scattered like seeds before a storm, trusting that some would find soil, some would take root, and some would one day, in another age, bloom. And then Atlantis fell. The accounts differ. Some say it was sudden, a single catastrophic night when the island was swallowed by the sea. Others describe a longer unraveling, years of earthquakes, of rising waters, of a sky that no longer felt safe. Both accounts may be true. Perhaps the fall was both, a long dying and a sudden end. What is certain is that the people of Atlantis fled, not in defeat, but in purpose, because they had already done what mattered. The knowledge was safe, the seeds were planted, the stone libraries were sealed. The teachers were already sailing toward the far corners of the world, carrying in their minds and their hearts everything that needed to survive. They did not look back with bitterness. The oldest stories say that even as the waters rose, they sang the old songs of the great convergence, sang for the world that had been and the world that would come again, sang for the children and the grandchildren and the many times great-grandchildren who would one day stand in front of a strange stone monument in a desert or a jungle and feel something stir deep within them, something old, something familiar, something that whispers, "You were here before. You built this. You are not a stranger to this place. You are coming home." And here we are. Here you are, sitting wherever you are, listening to this, and somewhere inside you, something is moving. I know it is, because you didn't find this show by accident. You didn't stumble onto this episode randomly. Something in you was looking for this. Something in you already knew. The knowledge was never destroyed. It was only hidden, encoded in stone, in symbol, in the DNA of every culture that carries a fragment of what once was whole. The pyramids of Egypt align with the same geometry as the temples of the Maya, thousands of miles away, with no official explanation for how they share a mathematical blueprint. The Sumerians wrote of beings who came from the sky and taught them the science of the heavens. The grid nodes still exist, some still active, still humming beneath sacred sites that every indigenous culture in the world has always known were special. The pale conquerors thought they won, and for a long time, a very long time, it looked like they had. But here is what they didn't count on. You. The age is turning. The cycle the Maya encoded in stone is completing. The knowledge that was hidden in the earth is rising again. The great convergence didn't just happen once. It is happening again, right now, in this moment. Every time one person wakes up and says, "Wait, there is more to this story than I was told," that is the grid. That is the pulse of the old world finding its way back. The four great nations scattered, but they did not disappear. Their blood runs in all of us. Their knowledge lives in the stone and the stars and the silent humming of a planet that remembers what we have forgotten. And we, all of us, right now, in this strange and broken and beautiful age, we are the ones who were promised. We are the generation the elders sang for as the waters rose. It is time to remember.
That is the story of Atlantis as I know it. Not a fairy tale, not a myth, a memory. A memory encoded in the bones of the earth and the blood of the people. If this episode reached you, if it cracked something open, if it confirmed something you already felt but couldn't say out loud, then do me a favor. Smash that like button. Share this with someone who is ready. Subscribe to Black Cube Productions 2022, because we are only just beginning. I'm Roger Cluton, and I'll see you in the next one. Or maybe I already have.